Is there a way that you can, and if you don't have this information, it's okay, but do you have an informal breakout of the demographics of your screened and accepted participants?
Yeah, so I do for our COVID trial because that like fully wrapped and published and they published the demographic results. So I actually have those and I pulled them in my document. Oh, here it is. Okay. Um, so for the COVID trial, when we started, the trial was 87% white. Um, by the time we ended, it was 66.41% non-Hispanic white, which is a little above US general demographics, which is about 59-60% non-Hispanic white. Um, Black participants were 13.8%. Hispanic participants were a little under 15%, a little under 2% for American Indian, Native Hawaiian, Alaska Native, which roughly correlates to demographics. And then Asian participants were probably below targeted, about 4%.
So according to the NIH,
Mm-hmm.
77% of clinical trial participants are generally white, 15% Hispanic, 14% Black, and about 3% Asian. In your experience, what have you observed regarding why there continues to be like an underrepresentation in clinical trials, especially for Asians and Hispanics who represent what,
Mm.
6% and 9%, 19% of the population respectively?
Yeah, I think a lot of it really comes down to the site selection. So there's an issue with this accessibility and travel. And oftentimes these are at academic institutions, which makes sense, right? They have the expertise, they have the knowledge. But they're just you take the University of San Diego is a great example. You think, oh, San Diego, this is a heavily Hispanic area. But you look at exactly where the University of San Diego is. It's in La Jolla, with a beautiful view of the Pacific Ocean and $2 to $3 million mansions that surround it. It's a very affluent area. It's a very white area, and its public transport links to the rest of San Diego are not great, to say the least. And so you just don't have. It's just not in convenient locations, which is a big issue. Some of our trials, particularly more commercial ones, have partnered more with like an urgent, like a city MD that's in in New York, in Crown Heights, or in a heavily majority minority area, which just helps because it's physically easy to get to. It's one of the you don't want to travel an hour to go to a clinical trial. You want one that's in your community and in your neighborhood. And if these are just in the wrong, heavily white areas, you're just not going to be able to recruit as effectively as you wanted to. I think from our experience, it was really required to have the good results that we had during the COVID trial. We got pretty close to US demographics. It was really doing like a fully integrated communication and marketing strategy. So we needed to target influential religious leaders, community validators, political leaders, medical workers who work in diverse communities. Put street teams on the grounds to go, basically pound pavement and talk to people about the trial and why they should participate and bring it to people's attention, right? Because they just didn't know about it. And then that traditional, advertising and putting the dollars behind, reaching non-white communities, and really also to getting the researchers, media interviews with, publications that reach reach Spanish-speaking audiences, or reach Caribbean American or African American audiences. And oftentimes I think it's more challenging to do that. It can be easier just to recruit off your known patient pool, and putting in that kind of work it's a burden to sites. They would love to do it, but every researcher has like 3 or 4 jobs already, and it's another thing for them to do. And they just want to get their trials filled as much as possible. I certainly think that the federal pressure and incentives that the National Institutes of Health and other groups are giving to promote clinical trial diversity and really set diversity targets tied to grants. So in the last couple of years, the NIH has been, when they give grant applications to academic institutions to do research, they have started to require specific demographic targets to be hit to unlock certain portions of the money. And obviously, that has helped greatly. Most of those have been really focused on recruiting African Americans and Hispanics. I haven't seen much federal pressure around recruiting Asian Americans. I certainly would expect that to change in the next couple of years. And I also think another challenge too, especially with Hispanic and other immigrant groups to the US, they oftentimes people, they speak English in their day-to-day for their job, but for things that are complicated, that might involve financial information or healthcare, they might
Health
prefer it.
literacy, in other words.
Yeah, exactly. They might prefer it in their like primary language because there's a level of, I speak French badly. I can read a French newspaper headline. I could not understand an informed consent in French. I would need that in English because I need to understand the nuance behind it and to really truly understand things and make things more comfortable. It's not like, the non-English language speakers, it's just complicated and it requires nuance and understanding, and there's slight subtleties of what exactly is being communicated. And so really putting, translating trial recruitment materials into multiple languages, doing the advertising in multiple languages and showing that this trial is open to everyone, definitely I think helps a lot. We've done a fair amount of like PR campaigns to non-English language media, which is big in the US. There's lots of newspapers that publish in various languages of immigrant groups throughout our country.
To your point about site selection, Mount Sinai, for example, they use a shuttle bus to get people to their location. But back to what you were saying about health literacy. So I would imagine that this is probably where a support person comes in, right? Because maybe that person speaks more English than they do and may be able to help them navigate. I'm just.
Yeah. So oftentimes, most hospitals have it's quite rare that they have like a translation service within them, so you can call up and you can get someone to translate. It's oftentimes the translations of materials is really it's just for the helping people feel more comfortable because they fully understand the document and the nuances.
For example, with Spanish language, so a Mexican Spanish speaker, they're going to use different idioms than Paraguayan or different from native Spanish. So there might be instances where it doesn't fully translate. They don't often use the same words for the same things. So I don't know that would be sufficient.
Spanish is interesting. So if we have a large amount of budget for advertising campaigns in Spanish language, we will actually cut them in multiple versions. So we'll cut a version for the Northeast that uses, Dominican and Puerto Rican terms. But if we're going into the Southwest, we're going into California, it'll be close to Mexican Spanish. It is not. Yeah, it is. That's a very good point. It is not one language in the US or one language in Latin America. It varies quite drastically on nation of origin. Oftentimes with Spanish language informed consents, we'll advise creating two versions of them. So there'll be one that'll be more for South American immigrants and one that'll be more for people from Central America. That is ideally you could do one from every country of origin because there are idiomatic differences. But when we can, we do try to do that. And then we encourage, if there's translation resources on hospital sites often, as well as people definitely bring. I mean, my parents are immigrants, and they have me read over complicated things. They don't understand the American healthcare system, and they speak English fluently. But and so oftentimes people will rely on their kids to sort of help navigate the system. When there are having being able to understand that sort of, I think, cultural nuances and linguistic nuances across Spanish really helps to make sure you have actually like fluent Spanish speakers on staff for us. And that's certainly, that's a even more complex if we were trying to do a campaign in Chinese in New York,
Right,
right?
because you've got Mandarin, you've got Cantonese, you've got the other dialects.
We're trying to recruit patients in New York City has 4 Chinatowns, right? We've got Chinatown in Manhattan, that's a Cantonese speaking Chinatown. We've got Chinatown and Sunset Park in Brooklyn, that speaks Fujianese, which is generally where sort of lower income Chinese American immigrants come from. We have Flushing, that's Taiwanese and Mandarin, and there's some subtleties between those. And then you've got a Chinatown in Elmhurst, Queens, which is very Vietnamese. And if we brought in 4 Chinese New Yorkers, they would argue for hours over which dialects we should use. So it's even more complicated in Chinese for sure. And it's Spanish, Chinese. It's also too, it's like, are we actually confirming what we think is true with people who come from these communities? I think is the important. And it's like a lot of these things. It comes down to really listening to people and understanding what they need and actually, is this actually resonating?
Then you have French and Creole. That's
Mm-hmm.
so it goes on. So in your non-clinical estimation, if there is, where is there a disconnect between potential participants in clinical trials? If you've seen that.
One, I think most people are completely ignorant of clinical trials. And I mean ignorant in the most neutral statement of them. They're aware of them in the way I'm aware of sports. We know it's going on, but we have no clue what's actually happening. And then I think other side of it is often people see this as like human guinea pig. That they're going to be testing something scary or unknown. And I think that's a part of it where oftentimes it's like, oh, this is a drug that's approved in Europe, but we need to get data to get it approved in the United States. This is a drug used for diabetes. Now we want to see if it can be used for, to help prevent cognitive decline. Oftentimes there's concern of, this is going to be a dangerous kind of thing, where it's oftentimes actually by the time you're testing it on humans, there's been, especially at a wide scale trial, there's been all these smaller trials to test for safety, to make sure things are as safe as they can be. There are obviously risks of experimental medicine. I think people have a lot of just instinctive fear of clinical trials, and see it as this like big scary thing, or that they're only for you have a terminal disease, and so that's why you join a clinical trial, because it's a lost ditch kind of hope and prayer, where actually this is this could be a foot fungus medication, it could be a medication being repurposed, and therefore a lot broader disease states than people I think they are.
So in your estimation, the resistance seems to be on the patient side then, not any unconscious bias on the parts of the institutions. I'm not putting words in your mouth, I'm just asking.
Yeah.
Because if people are ignorant to clinical trials, then I don't really see how they can be fearful of something they
yeah. I think by ignorance, they know that they exist, and like I mentioned this to people like I'm talking to like I'm trying to reshop my car insurance route, and I mentioned that I do this kind of work, and they're like, "Oh, you're looking for human guinea pigs?" Like that kind of reaction is like the
Hmm.
instinctive thing that I get from the random customer service phone calls, which is my scientific way of looking at this. I just think that there is that sort of like biases within it. I think as a communicator, right, as a marketer, I always say that if somebody doesn't understand something, it's my fault for not explaining it properly. And so I think that there is a level of certainly a level of bias. I think a lot of it comes down to like there hasn't been a concrete enough effort to explain the trial and its benefits at scale. And every trial is very unique in terms of like what it needs and who it needs to reach. Um, the I mean, certainly like there hasn't been, the ad council doesn't run ads talking about, why clinical trials are important, right? There isn't really that big push from the federal government to sort of explain research and its importance. I would say that there can sometimes be a level of like, it requires more advertising dollars to recruit people who are distrustful inherently, because you have to educate in a more complicated way. You have to have more touches. You have to be more patient, and that has dollar costs.
Mm.
In terms of advertising costs, time is money in terms of researchers' times, and oftentimes because it was expensive in the past or it will be expensive, there's just hesitancy to do it, and there is like a bias against doing that and advertising more aggressively in lower income areas. But I mean, I think that I think at the end of the day, as researchers and as people who recruit patients, we have to like evangelize and go out about the importance of clinical trial recruitment. And I think, I mean, it would be something I would love to see maybe an industry trade association or the ad council really get on and get out and explain why clinical research actually matters and how people's direct participation in clinical trials leads to new drugs on the market.
What would you say are the biggest lessons you've learned, or the biggest lesson? What is the biggest lesson you've learned in your work connecting patients with clinical trials?
So many good ones. I think, I mean, how disjointed everything has been really shocking. You mentioned earlier, 90% of doctors have no clue. The fact that there isn't a good system to put people in clinical trials has been kind of shocking and eye-opening, and it makes you think about how many people are unnecessarily being impacted by disease because we're failing to connect people properly. The That has been that. I think you see consistently within all the researchers that we work on a level of, absolute passion and commitment to finding cures and finding better treatment options and better treatment modalities for patients that often really, really, really comes across in people who have dedicated decades of their lives to studying a specific molecule or a specific disease state. And they have a level of like expertise and passion, which is really just like awe-inspiring to listen to. And I think what I think I've taken a lot of pleasure in is really when we present to academic institutions and researchers and be like, hey, this is the basics of marketing and how you can apply marketing strategies to your patient recruitment. For trials we might not even be directly working on, right? We've just been hired to go give this presentation and talk to academic researchers. And every academic researcher we talk to is far, far smarter than I am. But they're not marketers. They're not they're not marketers and they're not salespeople, and helping them apply those lenses and the skill sets that we have, when combined with their scientific expertise, really, I think has helped improve, trial outcomes and trial results. And yeah, I think it's certainly been an experience, and we've been doing it since 2020. And it's been very different than anything I've ever done previously in my life before.
So it sounds like it would be advantageous to the research community to have relationships with marketing, have marketing companies, at their side to help bridge the gap between, because there is that failure. And neither side seems to know how to get to the other side, and so
Yeah.
marketing that bridge. That's interesting to learn. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Quinton Maidment of the Bliss Group. Thank you so much for your time and for shedding light on the clinical trial enrollment process and all its fits and starts.
No, thank you so much for having me. This has been great.